All right, everybody, we're going to try and do the Cold War here. We may have to do it in a couple different little segments here. Cold War is going to happen after World War II. Here we are in the 20th century. I know we're into period 6. Hopefully you guys have a little bit of working knowledge about World War II. Long story short, the Allies win. And the Western world had worked very hard in the first half of the 20th century to work together for some type of peace. And then in 1941, before the United States enters World War II, several Western countries are going to come together to form the Atlantic Charter. And they meet in Canada. And the Atlantic Charter will take ideas from former President Woodrow Wilson's 14-point plan of peace that would help found the League of Nations after World War I. Then, in the midst of World War II, Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union worked together as allies, even though they had different governing ideologies, to defeat the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan in World War II. So for part of the war, there was this kind of sentiment of goodwill that's supposed to carry into the post-war period. But even before the war was over, those ideas began to crumble. In Tehran, Iran in 1943, the Western democracies, United States and Great Britain, promised a decisive second front in the war by the summer of 1944. Soviet Union was fighting in the Eastern Front. The United States and Great Britain had been in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, but we're going to land in northwestern Europe. If we do so, Stalin agreed to fight Japan, but his primary goal is to defeat Germany. And part of this comes, this negotiation begins to take place when Stalin reveals that he wanted to keep occupied parts of Eastern Europe. Some of these things he negotiated with Hitler years before, and he wants to hang on to them. Right? There is still a long way to go before the war is even over. Like D-Day hasn't happened yet. And so the Allies are like, okay, let's focus on defeating Germany and we'll worry about these political problems and ideas later. And by late 1944, Russia has pushed Germany out of the Soviet Union and back into Eastern Europe. And the Red Army, the Soviet Army, quickly gobbles up and conquers territory very quickly, like Romania, Poland, and Hungary, which the Soviet Union had been after trying to get for years and years and years. And then Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin both began to talk about how they would divide up the war, or the world, the Balkans rather, how they would divide up the Balkans, southeastern Europe, after the war. Now the Balkans had always been a trouble spot. Right? It's where World War I starts. But any division of territory could not be completed until the United States approved it. And President Roosevelt did not want to divide Europe into different spheres of influence. He's like, that's how we got started in these whole messes. So when the Allies win World War II in 1945, Germany will be divided into different zones. I'll have maybe it's in here later. I know I got this thing in here. Arms race, containment policy. All right. Germany is going to be divided into 4 zones. One each for the Allies. There's an American sector, there's a British sector, and a Soviet sector. And the French are like, wait, we want one too. And England gives some of their territory to France. On top of all of this, Germany is going to have to pay reparation payments once again to a sum of nearly 20 billion German marks. And the big question is, what's going to happen in Eastern Europe? What are we going to do with all of these territories? The Allies felt that the Soviet Union should be friendly neighbors. Look, these are your neighbors. You should not conquer them. That's what Hitler did. The Western countries also wanted Eastern Europe to be democratic and independent. Joseph Stalin says no. This would not be in the best interest of the Soviet Union. You are trying to erode our communist state. And his own psychotic paranoia prevented him from believing that the Allies were being open and honest. Right? So very quickly at the end of World War II, Stalin goes back on many of the agreements he had made with Prime Minister Churchill and President Roosevelt. The alliances are going to crumble, and the world is going to split into two parts. Right? It is. It's going to divide into two spheres of influence. The United States is going to head one sphere, United States capitalist, and the Soviet a communist one. And the United States and the Soviet Union are the only two major world powers left standing after victory. The United States is the superpower because of our nuclear technology. Both countries have vast economic resources and enough mobilized military power to dominate the globe. But these one-time allies become just bitter, hated rivals as the United States' economic and political ideology does not mesh well with the communist one. And each side had a very deep, distrust of the other. So after World War II, a new struggle will quickly grow that will shape the events of the 20th century. This becomes known as the Cold War, which is a constant state of tension and hostility among the United States and the Soviet Union without direct armed conflict. We fought each other, but not directly. We would do it through smaller countries, Korea, Vietnam, so on and so forth. The United States and the Soviet Union never square off. But here you have in the blue, the United States, Canada, Spain, Portugal, France, Great Britain. These are going to be the NATO countries, all right? Countries of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And this is the point where the Iron Curtain, so dubbed by Prime Minister Churchill here, is going to descend. In its earliest stages, the main focus of the Cold War centers on Eastern Europe. Joseph Stalin has two goals in mind for Eastern Europe. Number one, he wants friends. He wants friendly neighbors so he could spread and export his communist ideas into Eastern Europe. But also, Germany had attacked Russia. Both world wars there was fighting. And Russia wants a buffer. He wants a safety net, Stalin does, between himself and Germany. He wanted like-minded governments to give him protection should Germany somehow resurrect itself and attack Russia for the third time in the century. So as the Soviet army shatters Nazi forces and pushes them out of Eastern Europe, Stalin leaves behind part of his army as an army of occupation. And he wants to heavily influence this territory and impose his own political and social ideas. The United States and Great Britain bitterly complain. And Stalin says, niet, comrades. All right? You did not consult the Soviet Union when you concluded your peace with Japan. And we said, yeah, that's because you didn't help us fight Japan. You said you would and you did nothing. You were at the German peace conference. Guys, you helped. In Japan, you didn't do a gosh darn thing. Stalin says, well, we don't need to consult the United States, all right? When you also, or excuse me, the United States also didn't ask us what we thought when you occupied Italy during and after the war. We said, yeah, but we didn't occupy it. We fought there. We left soldiers until the war was over. This is completely different. And Stalin says, no, it's not. We're doing the exact same thing. And the Western powers disagree. However, Stalin says that we conclude peace our own way. And we said, well, you're leaving behind an occupying force is something different. And Stalin says, okay, it's for you guys to shut up. We are going to eventually promise democratic elections, or so-called democratic elections. He says so just to calm down the argument, but he quickly goes back on that promise. And the Red Army and local communists in Eastern Europe, especially in Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Poland, came out and were like, woo, Stalin, all right. And they were able to beat down all political thoughts, especially those that were democratic. So here in March 5th, 1946, at tiny Westminster College in Missouri, British Prime Minister Churchill gives his now famous speech that includes the famous quote here, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind it lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe, Budapest, Prague, Bucharest. And the term Iron Curtain is created by Winston Churchill, comes to symbolize the Cold War. It was used by the West to show the evil specter of communism, the Soviet sphere of influence, and the West's growing distrust of it. And so shortly after this, in April of 1945, or a year before this, excuse me, out in Muir Woods, out near San Francisco, 51 countries meet to draft the Charter of the United Nations. This world peacekeeping force where each member is going to sit in the General Assembly, sort of like the House of Representatives in the United States Congress, and each member is going to get a seat. There's also going to be a 15-member Security Council. Every 3 years, 10 members are going to rotate off, and there are 5 permanent ones. United States, Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and China. These 5 permanent members are like the Senate. Their job is to maintain the peace, but each of the 5 permanent members have the power to veto each other. So when the Soviet Union proposes something, the United States vetoes it. When the Soviet Union proposes something, Great Britain or the United States vetoes it. It goes back and forth. And so the UN takes a lot of heat, but it does do a lot of good work, like the World Health Organization, the World Bank. We're trying to bring, fresh water and food and infrastructure and education in third world countries. A lot of good goes on, but it's buried in a lot of bureaucracy and corruption. Now the United Nations has its headquarters, as you know, in New York City. So these are some of the goals: education, disease prevention, international aid. But the Cold War rivalries make it very difficult to get anywhere with this. And so it's eventually going to turn into an arms race. And what is eventually going to happen through much of the 1900s, there was a balance of power maintained by terror, as the United States and the Soviet Union will build up not only conventional but nuclear weapons. And both sides are going to spend crazy amounts of money one-upping each other. And an economist named George Kennan says, look, communism, if you guide it with a firm hand, isn't going to work. All we have to do is outspend them. With patience and a firm hand, it's going to collapse. And that is eventually what happens. So we'll get back to that in a little bit. Part of this is, here it is, with patience and a firm hand, communism is going to destroy itself. Well, President Roosevelt dies, and that is going to turn us into what we know as the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine by President Truman is created to stop communism, that he saw as an evil force creeping across the world, where he says the United States must look to and back up the free peoples of Europe and the world. We must save those who are being forced to be subjugated by communist aggression. And it is the Truman Doctrine that's going to guide our foreign policy for decades, as he calls it the containment policy. We are going to contain communism where it is, and we are simply not going to let it spread. That is the overall plan. And to help prevent this in Western Europe, we have the Marshall Plan. General George C. Marshall, who is head of the Army in World War II, is now Secretary of State. And he's most known for this, a plan to give aid to war-torn Europe. Several factors made communism appealing to Western Europe after World War II, after the conflict. The two biggest factors are hunger and poverty. All right? When people are hungry and they're in poverty, they'll listen to any voice. So to prevent democratic governments from falling into the trap of communism, Secretary of State George C. Marshall creates and offers an enormous aid package to the governments of Europe. We're going to bail you out. It was designed for the United States to send thousands of tons of food and billions of dollars in economic assistance to help European countries rebuild from the destruction of the massive World War II. This money helped areas of Western and Central Europe to recover more quickly than anyone thought possible. Instead of being isolationist, we're going to step out and give you money. And the United States will thus earn the goodwill of these countries. And they willingly followed the lead of the United States and President Harry Truman and his containment policy. However, Truman also said, offer this aid to Eastern Europe as well. And he does, but Joseph Stalin refuses to allow any Eastern European government to accept this aid, saying it's my responsibility. The Soviet Union is going to bail you out. Well, this just doesn't happen. And this will lead to the famous Berlin Airlift. So here is Western Germany, and here is East Germany. But inside of East Germany is the capital of Berlin, where the capital city, as I said, was split into 4 zones. And Germany becomes the very first focal point or flashpoint of the Cold War. The Soviet Union destroyed many of the German factories in the German zones that it occupied, fearing Germany retooling itself once again. The 4 zones monitored by the Allies helped Germany rebuild their industry, rebuild their infrastructure, their roads and their bridges, and their economy. So as Germany divides, like North and South Korea and North and South Vietnam, it's 2 nations. West Germany was democratic. They wrote a democratic constitution. West Germany was allowed to govern itself, and it received Western economic aid and becomes a major world industrial power. East Germany was governed by a communist government, which was heavily controlled by Moscow. And it's in the capital city of Berlin, which lay in the Soviet sphere, that the three Western Allied zones are surrounded by communist territory. We find our first crisis in the city of Berlin, the Berlin Airlift. 1948, Stalin tries to push the Allies out of Berlin by laying like a medieval siege to it. He seals off all the roads and access points, roads, bridges, railroads, and the people in Berlin were starving. Well, the United States, Army, Air Force, now Air Force was over there. So the United States responds by loading food and medical aid and clothing in planes and dropping them in parachutes, food, medicine, supplies around the clock. Right, now, not all of them made it into the Western Berlin, but a lot of them did. And Stalin, either he attacks these planes or he backs down. Not feeling like he should start another war, Stalin withdraws. But the embarrassment that the Berlin Airlift caused leads to a deepening of anger and hostility between the two former allies. The war has begun. And as we were going back here, Harry Truman, as I said, saw the ideology of communism as this evil force. And unlike the isolationist presidents after World War I, Truman was bound and determined to take a leading role in global affairs. He's going to do that to combat the spread of communism. And so that's where on March 12th he comes up with the Truman Doctrine and the containment policy. And Truman also stated that the free people of the world look to the United States for leadership. And the Truman Doctrine will guide the United States literally for the next 50 years to resist the expansion of communism anywhere in the world. And this brings us back to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Shortly after the Truman Doctrine was created, we're back to the beginning here, and the crisis over the Berlin Airlift ended, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is created in 1949. It's signed by the United States, Canada, other Western European countries to form a military defensive alliance, like the old Athenian Delian League. If any one of us are attacked by Russia, everybody else agrees to help. And originally, there are 11 member NATO countries. Well, the Soviet Union sees this as a threat. So to counter NATO, the Soviet Union developed its own defensive alliance in 1955, known as the Warsaw Pact. And the difference is that in the United States, or the NATO, you had a choice to join. In the Warsaw Pact, you were forced to join. These small countries, Romania, Poland, Hungary, are called Soviet satellite states. And they pledged that if anyone were attacked by a Western capitalist country, they would all jump in and come to their neighbor's aid. Now again, in the eyes of most people, the big difference is NATO was a voluntary alliance, and the Warsaw Pact is, well, you were dominated by the Soviets, you really don't have a choice. And so the Warsaw Pact countries must follow the demands of the Politburo in Moscow. In part 2 of this, we're going to look at some of the Arab-Israeli wars. We are going to look at Korea, Vietnam, and Cuba in part 2 of the Cold War. So hang on to that one. Get ready for that one, is what I'm trying to say.